evening. I'm Ellen Trepe from the Office of Alumni Relations at Thomas Jefferson University. I am happy to welcome you to tonight's discussion, where our speaker, Evan Laine, will cover the legacy of Pennsylvania Senator Arlen Specter. Throughout tonight's talk, we invite you to share any questions you have using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will address questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. If you don't see the Q&A button, please try moving your cursor and it should appear. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Evan Laine. Evan Laine is Associate Professor of History at Thomas Jefferson University East Falls campus. He is the Program Director of the Law and Society major and the Faculty Director for the Arlen Specter Center. Previously, he was an attorney specializing in civil trial law. He will be joined tonight by a very special guest, Shanin Specter. Mr. Specter is a trial lawyer and a founding partner of Clarence Specter law firm. He earned his undergraduate degree from Haverford College, his law degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and a Master of Laws with first honors from Cambridge University. He is also the son of the late Senator Arlen Specter. Professor Laine and Mr. Specter, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Professor Laine, the floor is yours.
That was a very nice introduction. Really appreciated that. I'd like to thank you for the excellent work you put into making this all happen. And I'd like to thank Alumni Relations for also setting this up. And I'd like to thank Mr. Shanin Specter for joining me tonight. And of course, all the wonderful Jefferson alumni that are out there listening tonight. Tonight, we're going to be talking about my book, which is Arlen Specter, Scandals, Conspiracies, and Crisis in Focus. And I want to tell you a little bit about how it came together, because I think that will fall into how I came up with these amazing stories. But I want to start with one thing. I'm a New Yorker. You probably figured it out within 5 minutes that I started talking to you. I really didn't know Arlen Specter. I knew he was a very powerful senator, but he was from Pennsylvania, and I paid attention more to New York politics. When I came down to Pennsylvania, I heard more and more about this man. And before you know it, I became director of the Arlen Specter Center. And thus I had to become an expert in who he is. And the stories I revealed and the depth of his power and influence over American politics was surprising and revelatory to me. So I want to take you through a little journey on how I got there. First, this is the Arlen Specter Center. This is a building right across the street from the East Falls campus library. This is where we have our meetings for Specter Center. Law and Society meets in there as well. And here is the opening day. And we can see over there on the left is my colleague, Karen Albert. There is our former president of the university, Steve Spinelli, and of course, Joan Specter, Councilman Joan Specter, Arlen Specter's wife, and Shanin Specter. So what do we do there? So before I get into this, it's going to be a commercial for the Arlen Specter Center. So I'm going to tell you what we do. Among the many things we do are the roundtables. There are 55 of them currently on YouTube and on SoundCloud, and they cover absolutely anything you could possibly think of. Every single society, conflict or crisis, and essentially they're students who come together with faculty in an open, safe environment, and we discuss items of the day. And here's just the end of one Specter Center roundtable, and you can see there are our coffee cups where we sit around and talk, the couches in front of the fireplace, and we speak under the portrait of Arlen Specter. So there's been over 20,000 views of our roundtables across the country, and we're very proud of them. One more thing I want to talk about the Specter Center before getting into the senator himself. We also have very big events. 2 years ago in April, we had two nurses who wrote a best-selling book called Nurses on the Inside about the beginning of the AIDS crisis in New York. And as you can see, it was extremely well attended. And again, Mrs. Specter attended, as you can see on the lower left. So how did this all start? Upstairs in the Arlen Specter Center, we did a recreation of the senator's office. And what the senator did, which was very unique, is he paneled his office with pictures. As you can see in the upper right-hand side, this is the best photo I have of it because I haven't been to campus in a while. There's all these photos. And people would come in to the Specter Center. I often would be their guide, and they'd look at these pictures and they'd say, "What is that?" I mean, what's going on in these pictures? And it's always Senator Specter with somebody important. And the first thing you think of, oh, it's just a selfie. People take pictures with important people as selfies. But when I started investigating these pictures so I can answer the questions, what was soon revealed to me is a history of America and a history revealed through Arlen Specter's relationship to some of the most important people and important events. And he wasn't peripheral. When you walk into the Specter Center downstairs and go to my office, there's a picture that the famous cartoonist Tony Off put together. It's a picture of Arlen Specter over a chasm. On one side is the Democratic Party, the other side is the Republican Party, pulling him both ways. And I think to be that he's pulled between two parties, but I interpret it as how he's always in the middle of almost every important thing that happened in the last 30 years when he was senator. So as I investigated these stories, I said to myself, there's a book in this because I'm learning about the man, and so should everybody else. I had the pleasure in this picture of being with Joan Specter and Jefferson Provost Dr. Bork. So this is the book. This is the chapters. And it was a hard thing to do to pick among the stories. So the hardest thing I have tonight is what stories do I tell you? Because we could be here for 4 or 5 hours just going through them. For example, we could talk about this. Here's Senator Specter with Yasser Arafat. And if you look at this picture carefully, it tells so much story. Look at the two gentlemen. Yasser Arafat is actually holding Arlen Specter. Understand that Arlen Specter had deep animosity at one time for Yasser Arafat because of the different terrorist acts that Yasser Arafat was blamed for and responsible for. But if you look at the picture, what's going on? And what the heck is that poster over on the left? And this is what brought me in, because I'm looking at this poster, and what I was revealed, believe it or not, is this poster actually saved peace in the Mideast. That this poster brought these two men together who were kind of natural enemies, sitting in an office. And at this point, Yasser Arafat wanted to renounce the Oslo Accords, which would have led to terrible circumstances. But then Yasser Arafat looks at this poster. This poster was purchased by Arlen Specter during a trip to the Mideast. And it's a phony poster. Clinton was never holding his arms up with Yasser Arafat asking for independence. It's put together, but it was everywhere. So Specter brought it in his office. Arafat looks at the poster and goes, hey, you have the poster. And Specter says, I do. And suddenly the gentlemen started talking, not as enemies, but as adults with a problem. And right there, Arafat agreed not to renounce the Oslo Accords, as long as Specter would announce in the Senate that Arafat was being reasonable. And he did on the Senate record. And he blamed or put the good part of this in the poster that put men together. But I'm not going to tell you that story. You're going to have to read more about it in the book. Or it could be about this. That's Michael J. Fox. And this is Muhammad Ali. What are they doing? Well, it turns out that Senator Specter, against all odds, especially in his party, fought desperately for stem cell research. He fought desperately when his own party was against funding it through the federal government. He fought it because he realized that he can, by funding it properly through the federal government, maybe relieve the suffering of Parkinson's disease, maybe relieve the suffering of cancer, maybe relieve the suffering of diabetes. Mary Tyler Moore also was involved in this with him. But I'm not telling that story either, because that's a long story. Or we can tell this story. Here is Senator Specter, a young DA, and he is charged by the governor of Pennsylvania to investigate these things called the magistrates. Years ago, instead of municipal judges who were real lawyers, we had magistrates who weren't even lawyers. Many of them didn't even have college degrees. What was discovered was they were running a scam against gay men in Philadelphia, where the police would arrest these men at theaters in a setup, bring them to jail and say, we can get you out of jail for $1,500. And it's split between the lawyer and the judge. And then the gentleman was let out of jail. You could imagine the stress that brought to the gay community. There weren't many heroes to the gay community and the straight community back then, but Specter was one. And he saw what he believed was an injustice going on, an unethical, immoral injustice. And he exposed it, and he had these people arrested and changed the magistrate system. He completely eliminated it. But you know what? I'm not going to tell you that story either. Or this. Arlen Specter was intimately involved in the Clinton impeachment hearings. He voted against impeachment. Very rare for his party, the only one, the GOP, who did. And the full story of the Clinton involvements, it's hard to find the right word, is in the book. But what I love, this picture is in the Arlen Specter Center. It's actually a huge plaque, and it's hard to read. But if you notice in the upper right, it has Bill Clinton's signature. On this is the signature of every senator and every congressman who was involved in the impeachment hearings. And Arlen Specter, because he voted against impeachment, got Bill Clinton to sign his own impeachment papers. The story of Monica Lewinsky and Clinton is in the book. But I don't have nearly enough time to tell you that story either, and how Arlen Specter was intimately involved in that. Oh, and by the way, before we get to what I want to talk about, I'm also not going to talk about Iran-Contra, which Arlen Specter was also involved deeply in, because President Reagan could not convince Arlen Specter to vote for funding for the Contras, which led to the legal arms agreement with Iran, our enemy, so that the profits of that went to the drug dealers known as Contras in Nicaragua, which very well could have led to the crack epidemic in California, and the creation of the Inspector General's office, which was a creation by Arlen Specter to check on the CIA. But I don't have time to tell you that story either. It's absolutely unbelievable when you get into the career of this man. There are people who serve in the Senate for 30 years just like him and don't create 1/10 of what he did or what he got involved with. So instead, I'm going to tell you this story. This is the story of Robert Bork, Judge Bork. And I call it Confirmation Spectacle, One Rejected, which is one of the chapters in the book. So let's talk about it. And you know, this picture looks a little different than the one Yasser Arafat, doesn't it? Look at the stance of the two men. Doesn't look like anyone's having a fun time over there, that's for certain. And I can tell one thing, in the pictures I've seen, Senator Specter is very telling on what his emotions are at the moment he's meeting people. So who's Robert Bork? Some of you will know, some of you won't. Ronald Reagan was to replace a judge on the court, and he wanted Robert Bork. Robert Bork had a very interesting reputation, let's put it this way. He was a brilliant man. There was no question about that. However, he was interesting. I'll tell you a story of the Saturday Night Massacre, which is in the book. Richard Nixon was president. He was under severe pressure to produce the tapes that would prove that he was involved in the Watergate scandal. When the court ruled that he had to have the tapes, Nixon fired the attorney general who was pushing him, wanted to fire the investigator that was pushing him to reveal the tapes. He called the attorney general, Elliot Richardson. He said, I want you to fire Archibald Cox, the investigator who's pushing me to produce those tapes. Archibald Cox says, no, that would be improper. Nixon fired him. It went next to the same night. It went to the assistant attorney general, who was Ruckelshaus. Nixon said to Ruckelshaus, fire Archibald Cox. Ruckelshaus said, no, that would be unethical. So it went to the next guy in line. That guy was Robert Bork. And Robert Bork said, okay, and fired Archibald Cox. So this is the reputation he had and why he immediately upon being selected ran into problems. Specter was not a fan of Robert Bork. And he wasn't, because you can see by the statement over on the right, Bork believed that he knew what the founding fathers of the Constitution meant when they wrote the Constitution. And Specter just didn't buy that. And this is a quote that I really like. He said, apparently Bork knew what the drafters and ratifiers of the Constitution had been thinking or could find out. If so, it gave him unique insight. The Constitution should be much more dynamic, a living, growing document responsive to the needs of the people. But here's the problem. Specter had promised Reagan that he would agree with any pick that he was going to pick. But he was against Bork. Fearing Bork would lead to segregation policies, overrule Roe versus Wade, Specter said, I don't think I'm going to vote for him. And the storm began. In 1 week, Specter received 50,000 pieces of mail, 750,000 overall during this, 50,000 telephone calls, and he received death threats. Robert Walker, who was a conservative Pennsylvania Republican, reminded Specter of his promise to back Reagan's nomination and warned him the religious right will see this vote as a betrayal. Now, this is the light stuff. Now, if we were in class, I'd have one of the students read this one. I want you to take this in. This is not a letter from a lunatic. This is a letter from a House of Representatives, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania member, and this is what it says. Dear Benedict, before referring to Benedict Arnold, go to hell. Can you believe this? Sincerely, Mr. Sirianni. Now, what you're going to love here is the response. I would like right now to introduce Shanin Specter to read what his father responded.
So this was Carmel Sirianni, a she, not a he, and actually a pretty good friend of my father's, except for this moment in time. Dear Carmel, thank you for your letter of October 7, instructing me to go to hell. I found it particularly interesting in light of a recent column by A.M. Rosenthal, a copy of which appeared in the Harrisburg Patriot News on October 12. Rosenthal recounted that in response to an earlier column suggesting that Judge Bork was not really a judicial conservative, Rosenthal had received a letter from Irving Kristol, the noted conservative, characterizing Rosenthal's column as mindless and asinine. After describing the Kristol letter, Rosenthal wrote, I will cherish this letter as it epitomizes the level of intellectual discourse that so many of the supporters of the Bork nomination have managed to attain in reply to his criticism, unquote, I will cherish your letter sincerely.
You gotta love that. You gotta love that. You could even see here, this is from Bill Goodling, who was a congressman. And Bill Goodling basically told Senator Specter that if he comes into the area where Bill Goodling is a congressman, he might be killed. I can't believe it. I think it would be in your best interest to stay out of the central portion of the state for the next couple of months until people cool off, because I'm afraid some might not be responsible for what they say or do. And this is the blowback he was getting. It was unbelievable. This is from James Clymer, a conservative caucus chair. And basically what he said is that Arlen Specter is a Benedict Arnold. He's joining the liberal lynch mob that wrongly slandered Judge Bork. And it says the facts are plain and simple. Senator Specter is a traitor to the Republican Party and its president who assisted in his re-election bid. And more importantly, he said he'd be a dead duck in the Republican Party. So this is what happened. Because Specter opposed Bork, because Specter went against the president, because Specter went against the Republican right, he was vilified. Bork blamed Specter for him not being confirmed. And I really love this thing what Specter says. He said he blamed it not on him, but on Bork's inconsistencies and repeated shifts in position. And I love this quote. He tried to ride two horses and fell from both. So Bork was not selected. And I think we're running out of time, so I want to get into Clarence Thomas. So you can't approach Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill without understanding Bork, because policy over party. The party pushed hard on Arlen Specter to vote for Robert Bork. But Specter thought it was not the right thing for Pennsylvania and not the right thing for the United States. And it would hurt him, and it would hurt his career. And you can see it even affected his possible living, but he still pushed on because it was right. And the reason why I'm focusing on this is because this is not in a vacuum. And why I didn't focus on the earlier stories that I teased is because of the situation we have right now in our country, where party is over policy. That party has become everything. That the best interest of the United States and the best interest of the electorate are not put forward, but rather the best interest of the career of the politician and who wins and what party's in front means more. This was a time that we have to cherish when politicians would put policy over party, policy over self-interest. And that's why I emphasize the Bork hearings. But it brings us to Clarence Thomas. And I tell a story that many may not know about them. Bush claimed that he chose Thomas because he was the best qualified and best prepared, the best man at the right time. Clarence Thomas was not the best qualified. He had served a very short period of time as a judge. He had a very indistinguished career. He had not argued anything in the appellate courts, and he had never written an important decision in his career as a judge for that short period of time. So Specter was going to meet with Thomas. And he was very concerned about affirmative action, because Specter was a very strong supporter of affirmative action, which, of course, went against the Republican Party as well. And he asked Tom Dadu and Richard Hertling, his legal assistants, to look into it. Has Thomas ever given an opinion on affirmative action? You can see, no, that he was kind of mixed on it, and they really didn't have much of a handle on it. So he was going to have a conversation with the judge. And he did. And in that conversation, which took place, which you can see is very congenial over here, he asked Clarence Thomas, is he in agreement with the Supreme Court cases, and especially said this case called Metro. This Metro case supported affirmative action very strongly. And Thomas said, I don't have any problem with it. Supreme Court, it is what it is. This is a story many of you probably don't know. Specter had met with Thomas, was satisfied on the affirmative action issue. The day of the vote in the Judiciary Committee on Clarence Thomas, a story comes out in the Legal Times, which is a local Washington paper. And it states the following, that there's a case called Lembrecht versus FCC. And that was not decided, it appeared in front of a 5-panel court. One of the judges was Clarence Thomas. One of the judges who wrote the opinion on that case was Clarence Thomas. That case was against affirmative action and very strongly rebuked Metro, very strongly. But where was it? Why wasn't it in the legal papers? Why wasn't it in the legal books? Why didn't anyone know about this? Well, this is why. Because Clarence Thomas knew he was going to be considered for a judge. He understood the predilections of Arlen Specter and his belief in affirmative action. So what he did is he wrote the opinion, but he didn't sign the order. And for non-lawyers out there, this is what it means. The opinion is what the judge thinks and what he thinks the law is in his 3-2 majority opinion. But when you don't sign the order, it's basically, I hereby this day ordered and decreed that, the opinion is not operative. As soon as you sign, it's like a check. You write out the check, but without the signature, you can't cash it. Well, he purposely did not sign it so he can say to Specter and other senators, hey, I never wrote an opinion against affirmative action. Specter found out about the article, called him in his office that day right before the vote. He looked Thomas in the eye, and Thomas said, nope, the story's wrong. No such thing. Well, the story was right. And we know that because after Thomas was selected, after he became a Supreme Court justice, he took a 1-hour holiday to go back to his previous desk. He signed the order as an appellate court judge, and then he went back to being a Supreme Court justice. These are stories people don't know. That's in the book. So Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas of harassing her sexually when she worked for him. The Republican Party, having found out about this, was concerned. And they wanted initially, when she testified, hire a private attorney, but they thought that would look bad. So they called Senator Specter and they asked him, can you be the cross-examining attorney? And he said no. He didn't see how that would fit in for the needs of the people of PA. But they pushed him and said, we need you, and you weren't there for us in Bork, and that's why the Bork thing is important. So he agreed. And during the cross-examination, he accused her of perjury. He said that her credibility had been demolished on the stand. And Senator Specter, till this day, has received a lot of negative heat because of this. In the end, which I'll get to in a second, it didn't matter all that much because the end was going to be what it was. But I had asked in the book, why would Specter support Thomas when he didn't support Bork? And that was something that I put a lot of time into. So what I'd like to present to you is what I discovered. First, the obvious, mending offenses. He was going to be in a new election. He had totally alienated the Republican right. And this was a way of gaining them back. There's no question that the Republican senators played on his ego during that phone call, saying, only you could do it, Arlen. You're the district attorney. You're famous for cross-examination. You can do it. He also was very concerned about the credibility of Anita Hill for various different reasons. After she allegedly said the harassment took place, she followed him to a new job. And he was concerned about that, saying, why would she go to another job where he's her boss again if he harassed her? Secondly, after she left the second job, she continued over the next 8 years to contact him approximately 11 times for getting letters of recommendation or other social events. Anita Hill kept no notes and no records, and she was an attorney, which concerned him because if she had records of this harassment, it would have meant something to him. We have, of course, being insensitive, being an elderly gentleman in that time, not understanding how difficult it is for women in the workplace. But this is something that Duda and Hertling told me. Specter was concerned that Thomas, who is replacing a very famous African-American judge, Thurgood Marshall, the first and only up to that point, and there would be no Black person on the court. And he was concerned because if Thomas didn't get it, the chances of another African-American being appointed by the Republican Party was very low. And he felt that from what he knew about Clarence Thomas, that he might grow on the court, much like many others did. And finally, Jack Danforth was a very strong proponent and mentor of Clarence Thomas and a very good friend of Specter and many other Democratic and Republican senators who believed in him and his credibility, and Danforth strongly recommended. So this is why, according to the book, why Specter agreed to cross-examine and why he voted for Clarence Thomas. But as Specter says in his book, none of it really mattered because the focus of the trial went from harassment to race. And those of you who don't remember, there's a famous quote from Clarence Thomas where he said to the entire panel, "This is a circus, a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a Black American, as far as I'm concerned, it's a high-tech lynching for uppity Blacks." And it was a good strategy because this is what the Judiciary Committee looked like. And you can see all white men. And it was a very good ploy because the question didn't revolve anymore about harassment of Anita Hill, but harassment of a Black man by an all-white Judiciary Committee. And that's what won the day for Clarence Thomas. I'd like to at this point ask Shanin Specter again about the blowback that his father got when he was about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill and how he handled it.
Well, that's kind of a long topic, Evan. He got a tremendous amount of criticism from many people in Pennsylvania and across the country with respect to his handling of the Hill-Thomas hearings. Frankly, he also got a lot of praise for his handling of the Hill-Thomas hearings from people who were supportive of now Justice Thomas. But the criticism was relentless, and he approached it by sitting down with people who were unhappy with him, a lot of women's group leaders, a lot of his friends who were unhappy. He then held open house town meetings across Pennsylvania with particular emphasis on the neighborhoods where there was particular concern. It tended to skew more upwardly mobile. Candidly, the folks in the Black community, for the most part, did not care about Anita Hill's testimony. They were more concerned about bread and butter issues. The issue really percolated most in places like Society Hill in Philadelphia, Chestnut Hill, Lower Merion Township, Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh, places like that. So he went out there and did open house town meetings to deal with the issue, probably about 10 or 12 of them. But still, he sustained a permanent 5% reduction in his popularity in Pennsylvania. And in a lot of polling that I looked at in ensuing races, all throughout his career. It didn't stop in 91, which was the year of these hearings, but in 92, 98, 2004, 2010, during all of those election cycles, when we looked at polling, still saw a tremendous number of people, again, roughly 5%, who said words to the effect of, I would never support Arlen Specter because of his handling of the Hill-Thomas hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Specter. I'd like to point out, going back to the Bork selection, because there are those who also looking at choices made and choices not made, that Bork not going on the court was perhaps one of the most important decisions in Supreme Court history, because Bork joining Thomas and Scalia at the same time would have had a very strong effect on civil rights. So when you look at a situation, I heard a really good quote today. I was watching the Lincoln documentary that's on CNN, and it talked about politicians, and it said, in today's society, what we tend to do is look at decisions made, whether they're good or evil. But decisions by especially politicians almost always seem to fall in the middle, because there's so many different interests that have to be satisfied. And in judging somebody on what they do, whether it's a Judiciary Committee or whether it's dealings with Yasser Arafat or Fidel Castro or Iran-Contra, all this, we have to look at the larger picture of who they were and what they accomplished. And then you can properly make a decision on someone's career. I know we're wrapping up in time, and I can tell you, if we go back even to the beginning, do it quickly, and just see the chapters. Okay, here we go. There's so much to a career. And the reason why I wanted to bring that out is that that's what I always hear when people talk about Arlen Specter. They talk about the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings. But I'll always say, do you know what happened in the Bork hearings? Do you know what happened during the stimulus vote, where the only way the stimulus passes because Specter went against the party. Do you know what happened with stem cell research? With the only reason why stem cell research wasn't outlawed as cloning is because of the efforts of Arlen Specter. So when you look at a career, you weigh it on its totality, and you look at the circumstances that existed at the time. Wrapping this up, I know we're running out of time. When you judge somebody's career, you look at what did they accomplish? Were they just along for the ride? Did they call themselves a senator because they liked the idea of being a senator? Or did they really attempt to change things? And looking at this list, even number 10, the insanity plea is different in America because of Arlen Specter. Castro, our relationships with Cuba was influenced by Arlen Specter wanting to increase our relationships and have a better understanding of that country than what we had at the time. So when judging a man, we look at the accomplishments of a career. And this was a career that meant something. This was a man who meant something, who influenced policy, who influenced American history and world history. And at that, I'd like to go to Ellen to introduce some questions for Mr. Specter and myself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Laine. And the first question, I think, I'll remind our attendees that if you do have a question, please, you can send it to us through the Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. And if you don't see that, once again, move your cursor and it should appear for you. And I think maybe where I'd like to start with some of the questions that have come through, because I think it'll be interesting to hear, Professor Laine, from you as a scholar of Arlen Specter, and then from you, Mr. Specter, as someone who was personally and intimately involved in what was happening in his life. How do you both think that he ultimately came to think about his switch to the Democratic Party?
I'd like to throw that over to Mr. Specter because he was very much involved in that decision.
Well, let's go back to February of 2009. The country was in a very deep recession, the so-called Great Recession. And there was real talk about being in a depression. And there was the stimulus bill in the Congress, which was hoping to rescue the economy, much like the bill that was passed last spring in relation to COVID, and again now with respect to COVID. And there was no Republican support for the bill in the House, and there was virtually none in the Senate. There was talk from Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe about voting for it. My father decided to vote for it. He, along with Senators Snowe and Collins, cast the deciding votes for it to be passed. That did not cost my father a permanent 5% of approval among Pennsylvania voters. Rather, it cost him a permanent 30% point disapproval among Republicans. He went from 60% approval among Republicans to 30% among Republicans. And that could not be reversed under any circumstances because it was seen as such a fundamental betrayal of the Republican Party to be supporting what President Obama was trying to do at that point in time. And my father did a lot of things to try to rectify the situation. Again, going out to the counties, having meetings with people who were unhappy. That was unsuccessful. So he had a choice. He had essentially four options. He could retire. And that's what a lot of people would have done in that position. He was 79. He'd served for 30 years. He had a great career. Lots of senators facing a difficult reelection would retire. He could run as a Republican, and he came to the conclusion that he would almost certainly lose to now Senator Pat Toomey. He could run as an independent, but Pennsylvania in the last 50 years, the high watermark for independence has been 12.8%. So that was not something that was really feasible given the nature of Pennsylvania politics. or he could switch parties. He had a very substantial war chest of campaign funds, $8 million in February of 2009. And so, and he wanted to continue in the Senate. And my father was a very tough guy, very tough guy. And he wasn't afraid to lose. He lost plenty of elections. The risk of losing, the risk of leaving the Senate as having lost his last race did not bother him at all. The idea of not trying bothered him. And so he wanted to stay and he wanted to fight for the things he cared about. He couldn't do it as a Republican for the reasons I've described. And so he switched parties in order to try to continue his work. And I think he made the right decision for him. He was ultimately not successful in being nominated by the Democratic Party in the ensuing year, but he had no regrets about it because he tried. And I think there's a strong object lesson there that all of us should stick to our principles, stick to our guns, never give in, which was the title of one of his books. And I think his decision, while it would not have been made by most people in his position, it was the right decision for him.
I'd like to add too, because there's right now, what's going on is the question about filibuster and cloture. And a lot of people don't know. And Senator Specter was pivotal in that, because the president, Obama, although he had a majority of Democrats 58, GOP 42, there is this procedural item which was added after the Constitution called the filibuster. That is, if one party continues to talk and talk and talk, even if they're in the minority, a bill cannot be voted on. And that's what a filibuster is. And what the Republicans wanted to do, although there was only 42 of them in the Senate, and the Congress was way in majority, there's not a problem there. Although it was only 42, if they filibustered the stimulus, they could kill it. And at that point, we were, and a lot of us, I'm sure, remember, in the desperate throes. Banks were closing, insurance companies were closing. The world was in a disaster, and something was needed to be done. And the Republican Party essentially said, if Obama's for it, we're against it, period. It was actually said by several top Republicans. And actually Biden probably told Senator Specter who said it. But if no matter what it is, if Obama's for it, we're against it. And if they would have filibustered it, there would have been no stimulus. And I don't really know what would have happened. Specter voted in a thing called cloture. And in cloture, you can stop the filibuster if there's enough votes. You need 60 votes to say no more filibuster. And there was only, as I told you, 58 Democrats. Specter said, I'm going to vote for cloture. I'm going to stop the filibuster. And he brought over Snowe and Collins. And that's what stopped the cloture. And there's no question, according to President Biden now, that Specter was the person they needed to push over. If he went, then Snowe and Collins went. So we would have had a stimulus had it not been for Specter defeating the cloture, defeating the filibuster by voting for the cloture. But it killed his career eventually, as Mr. Specter has told us. But he did it because I'll go back to you, Mr. Specter. He knew his career was on the line. Why did he do it?
The issue was too important not to do what was right for the country. It wasn't a question of one justice out of 9. The nation would have survived Robert Bork, probably. The nation has survived Clarence Thomas. The nation was really in peril in February of 2009. And my father said to me, we were talking about it before the vote. He said, what's this going to cost me politically? And I said, I don't know, Dad. I said, Anita Hill cost you 5 points permanently. Maybe this will cost you 5 points permanently. He said, I don't think it's going to be just that. He said, but here's how I'm looking at it. He said, I'm not sure 100% what I would do if I were 59, but I'm 79. And he said, I'm thinking about my father. And, of course, I knew what he meant by that, because his father had struggled all of his life, and he had a very tough time during the Great Depression. And the Specter household was essentially destitute for much of the Great Depression. And the idea of another depression was unfathomable to my father. If he could prevent it, he felt he had to. And he felt he would be disappointing his father if he did not vote for the stimulus, which I think everybody on this call understands that concept, right? So he recognized he was likely staring into his political graveyard, but he thought that it was something that was necessary.
And that's why this talk is called Policy Over Party, no doubt. And I want to add that although he was out of power, your father, and very sick, when President Obama needed advice on a very important issue, that your father was an expert, even though your father, I believe, was in the hospital at the time, and not too long for the world. President Obama called Senator Specter on his sickbed and asked for his help in a very important issue. So it just goes to show you that here's a Democrat calling the Republican for the help of the nation at that point. And I think that says it all.
At that point, Evan, he was a Democrat.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
But, realistically, the reason why, respectfully, you don't remember that is that he didn't change his mind depending upon which party he was in. He was always basically, as the Tony Off cartoon said, he was always basically in the middle. He was not enough of a Republican for the Republican Party ever. The Bork, problem was just one of many problems. I'm not going to bore you with all of them. His support of Clarence Thomas gave him a short-lived bounce in the Republican Party, but they got mad at him again, as witnessed, the stimulus, but many other things that intervened. I won't, again, take up your time on that. And that is what happens when you are in the middle. You are subject to the slings and arrows, but you also can be much more effective. Look what's happening today in the Senate. Who's the most powerful member of the United States Senate? It's not Chuck Schumer. It's not Mitch McConnell. It's Joe Manchin from West Virginia, because he holds the key vote. That's what my father held for a long time, along with a very small number of others. And that allowed him to have an outsized influence on American policy.
Turn that to Ellen. I'm sure there's other questions. I know we went on, but this is interesting.
I think this might be one of our, I'm going to ask sort of a big one, because I think that will take us to the end of our time. And there's two that have come through that I really love, so I'm going to kind of smash them together. So Dana asks, how did Senator Specter handle growing partisanship in politics? And what did he do to prevent or alleviate it? And then I'm going to combine that with, so what advice do you think that Senator Specter would have given to President Biden to help unite the country if he were alive today?
I'll start it and then hand it over to Mr. Specter. When Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House, Senator Specter saw a change in the tide. He saw these young people coming in, John Boehner, Rick Santorum. He saw the Tea Party people coming in, and he saw a change in attitude in the Republican Party that he didn't feel part of. As Mr. Specter stated already, he was never really a full Republican to begin with, but he sensed a tide change that he was not happy about, a different philosophy, a different way of dealing with each other. Specter's relationship with Biden, who is a Democrat, they were the closest of friends and able to discuss policy and talk about what was best for their states and best for the country, even though they were on different parties, because there was that that way of handling each other, we could disagree and still like each other. We don't demonize each other. We could actually work out things between us. And they rode the train together, and they often on the train from Washington to Delaware and PA would work out things which they said was best for their constituents and their country. So he felt a change that was going on. And I'd like to turn that over to now to Mr. Specter.
Well, I think my father and then Senator Biden had virtually identical views on public policy, despite the fact that one was a Republican and one was a Democrat. Joe Biden had a tough reelection campaign at one point in Delaware, and he asked my father to make a television ad endorsing him. That was complete heresy. The idea of a Republican senator making a TV ad to support an incumbent Democratic senator, I've never heard of it ever. And the problems that my father would have had if it had been aired with his caucus would have been monumental. My father made the ad for Joe Biden and said to him, "Joe, this will cause me a lot of problems with my caucus. Use it, but only if you have to." And as it worked out, Biden didn't need the ad and didn't use it. But wouldn't it be great? Just think about this: if Democratic members of the House and Senate would campaign for Republican members who were sensible, and vice versa. It would be so great for the common weal. I think that Joe Biden recognizes that. I know that this $1.9 trillion COVID bill is not going to have any Republican support. I know that Joe Biden wishes it were to the contrary. I know he tried very hard to accomplish that, which began, of course, with that meeting in the Oval Office that lasted 2 hours. It was his first meeting in the Oval Office with members of Congress. And who did he meet with? He met with Republicans. So I think that there is good hope. And I think that if my father were around, he would be delighted that his close friend Joe Biden was making those efforts. And I do think there is good reason for at least some optimism that there will be bipartisan efforts. We see it with Joe Manchin. We did see it on the impeachment vote in the House. We did see it on the conviction vote in the Senate. And I think there's more room for that as we go forward. But obviously, we have a long way to go. We have a terribly polarized society. We have folks who set up in their warring camps. We have a polarized media. And we need to make strong efforts to try to talk to each other.
Ellen, do you have anything else for us?
I think that will take us there to the end. Thank you both so very much for your time tonight and for sharing these wonderful stories with us. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We hope that you will try to join us for another Alumni Relations program soon, and that you have a wonderful evening. Thank you all so much.